Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Griffin, and I am the Executive Director of Associated Chamber Music Players, ACMP. And I'm delighted to introduce, for the second time now, the London-based composer, conductor, violinist, and educator, Peter Fender, who is going to guide you through an exploration of Brahms' famous piano quintet in F minor. So, Peter, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thank you, Stephanie.
Oh,
So just wet my whistle. Not that I'm going to whistle, don't worry. So yes, it's just a thank you to Stephanie and ACMP for asking me to come do this. I'm delighted, having very much enjoyed talking to you about the Schubert Octet. When was that? Was that back in July, I think? So this is a great, for me, great follow-up to that, the Brahms Piano Quintet, Opus 34. Brahms Piano Quintet is a fine piece of music. I hope you will agree with that statement by the end of today's session, if right now you're not so sure. In Jan Swarford's biography of Brahms, it's noted that the piano quintet is often called the crown of his chamber music, or as composer Robin Holloway has written, one of this great composer's greatest works. To put those assertions into context, consider Brahms' instrumental chamber music as a whole, of which we have two-string sextets, two-string quintets, three-string quartets, three piano quartets, three piano trios, a horn trio, a clarinet trio, a clarinet quartet, two clarinet sonatas, also for viola, two cello sonatas, three violin sonatas, and I've really not finished that list, have I? So to claim the greatness of the piano quintet in the context of those many other wonderful pieces is quite something. Anyway, before we go any further, I think we should just relax by listening to a little bit of the quintet. Let me just play you a short excerpt to start with. Sorry, beg your pardon. I'll get something wrong right at the beginning, then I shall get nothing wrong ever again. That was the start of the scherzo of the piano quintet. It's a piece that has an interesting history, which gives it a little extra je ne sais quoi. Brahms originally wrote it, you may know, as a string quintet, subsequently arranged it as a two-piano sonata, before turning it into the piano quintet that we know and hopefully love. I'm going to look into those origins, consider, in my opinion at any rate, which of these versions of this music worked the best. I'll also look into the quintet itself in more detail, both from a musicological and a performance perspective, as I did when talking about the Schubert Octet. and also a little bit consider rather the effect that the piece has on an audience. It's quite a dark work overall. So a little bit about its origins. I was rather excited when I first found out that this quintet had originally been a string quintet, but that excitement only lasted for a few seconds when I then realised that this string quintet is lost, presumably destroyed by Brahms himself. Brahms, in fact, had a habit of destroying music, his own music, that is, that he wasn't completely happy with. For example, it's been estimated that he destroyed more than 20 either complete or partial string quartets before his first quartet was published in 1873. In May of 1891, whilst drawing up his last will and testament, Brahms conveyed to his publisher, Fritz Zimroch, his instructions concerning the fate of those of his works that remained unpublished at the time of his death. He wrote, "I wish that all I leave behind in manuscript, unpublished, be burnt. I am now taking care of this as best as possible. You will find little on which you will be able to fulfill my wishes. I am scrupulously taking care that nothing superfluous is left." Also, unlike some composers, there are very few of Brahms's surviving compositional sketches. Again, he destroyed many of them himself. What was going on here? It wasn't a process actually that he found easy. It's not difficult to compose, he once wrote, but it is incredibly difficult to let the superfluous notes fall under the table. Quite simply, Brahms wanted to control his legacy, once writing that he wanted his music to be both beautiful and unassailable. Crucially, Robert Schumann had announced early on that Brahms would be the next great composer after Beethoven, a prediction that Brahms was determined to live up to, and which led him at times to a crippling lack of self-confidence. For example, contributing to the well-known long delay in the completion of his first symphony. As an aside, one might reasonably ask whether a composer is best placed to say which are his or her best works. Music, in my opinion, is a form of communication, and a composer can only understand their own side of the communicative event, which in the end, of course, is the performance of a composition. Do they feel they've realised their internal intentions, even assuming, of course, they know what those are? Even if they do, then they can never genuinely be in the shoes of the listener, who brings just as much to the communicative event as does the composer. Not that I'm suggesting that a composer's best works are their most popular ones, but rather that it's a complicated issue. It would have been nice to have had a little chat with Brahms about all of that. Anyway, back to the piano quintet. As I said, it went from that now lost, probably destroyed string quintet version to a version for two pianos to the piano quintet, or in other words, from all strings to all pianos to a mixture of the two. Now, we can't compare the piano quintet with Brahms' original string quintet, but we can do that between the quintet and the sonata for two pianos. So let's just make a small comparison. I'll do a little bit more as we go along. But here is coming up the opening segment of the second movement. So yes, there was obviously firstly the piano quintet version, and secondly the sonata for two pianos version. I'll talk a bit more about such comparisons as we go along. So Brahms, like many other composers, was very adept at making arrangements, having started this type of work early in his life when he made arrangements for the Ulster Pavilion Orchestra, just a six-piece band that played in a fashionable pavilion in Hamburg in Germany, in which his father was the double bass player. Perhaps unsurprisingly, none of the arrangements he made for this group survived his cull. Of course, it was also standard practice to arrange one's own larger scale compositions for the forces of a piano or two, or for a chamber music group, in order to reach a wider public and essentially sell more scores. Brahms also sometimes did this for compositions by other composers, for example, arranging Schumann's piano quartet for piano duet. Studying other composers' arrangements and then trying your own, it's something I always recommend for people who want to learn composition. Think what can be learnt, for example, by studying Ravel's masterful arrangements of his own Tombeau de Couperin or Mother Goose suites. Of course, this time going from small to large, piano to orchestra. Not to mention Webern's arrangement of the Ricercar from Bach's Musical Offering, Liszt's piano arrangements of Beethoven's symphonies, Salomond's chamber arrangements of Haydn's symphonies, Stokowski's arrangements of, well, all sorts of things. Indeed, Schoenberg's arrangement for orchestra of Brahms' own piano quartet in G minor. Of course, I've only scratched the surface there, choosing a few of my favourites. But back to the quintet, of which there are at least two arrangements now for full orchestra by Robin Holloway, who I mentioned earlier, and Henk de Vlieger. There's even an arrangement for piano and orchestra, sort of piano concerto by Nick Horton. Let me just play you a short section of the version by Robin Holloway, the orchestral version. This is part of the first movement. Sorry, one sec while I find the right page to show you in the quintet. Also, although I'm playing you the orchestral version, I thought it would be worth having the score of the quintet up so you can see what has been arranged by Robin Holloway. And here's the quintet version of the same passage. Some very tasteful portamenti going on there. Could certainly spend quite a lot of time, if one wanted, comparing and contrasting the actual Brahms works just themselves, the quintet and the piano sonata versions. But really time doesn't allow us to deal with that in any more detail today. Perhaps that's an idea for a rainy day. As an aside, perhaps one or two of you may have thought, well, is there any connection between the original string quintet, which Brahms wrote, and his published string quintets, Opus 88 and 111? The answer is probably not. Those pieces were written much later, 1882 and 1890, 17 and 25 years after the quintet we're dealing with, and I don't think there is any connection in Brahms' mind. The music is quite different. A little bit more about the history of the quintet, which will put some of this stuff in context. During a stay in Vienna in 1862 to 1863, Brahms became more and more interested in Schubert's music. He was particularly taken by Schubert's string quartet, which had been his last chamber work, and which, although written in 1828, the year of Schubert's death, was not published or indeed premiered until the 1850s. For one thing, the complement of musicians was the same: string quartet plus extra cello, which became an unusual form for the string quintet. F minor, the key of Brahms' quintet, was also the key of the central section of Schubert's Adagio. The third movements of both pieces have a same type of shifting C major, C minor dialogue. And the ending of that particular movement, the third movement, the one I played a little excerpt of right at the very beginning, has a similar emphasis in both pieces at certain points on the flattened supertonic. So in other words, it's in C, so the flattened supertonic being the D flat. Let me just play you, although I apologise, I'm not showing you a picture of Schubert now, I'm showing you a picture of Brahms while I play you a little bit of the end of the Schubert, and then I'll play you a little bit of the end of Brahms' third movement, and you can just hear, I think, quite clearly how they both use that D flat to C flat. As well as the one idea I already gave you for a rainy day, there's another one looking through the Brahms quintet at all the use of semitones. There's the semitonal hang, if you like, a semitone hanging above the tone it wants to resolve to is quite a common issue throughout that piece. Both Clara Schumann and the great violinist Joseph Joachim admired the string quintet that Brahms had written. However, problems were also noted. Joachim wrote, "The work is difficult, and I'm afraid that without vigorous playing it will not sound clear." I'm not sure we would disagree with him. After having rehearsed it, he wrote, "It is a work which in every line some shows proof of overpowering strength. But what is lacking to give me pure pleasure is, in a word, charm." Brahms altered some passages after these comments, but he still wasn't satisfied. He then turned it into the two piano sonata completed in 1864, published a year later and premiered in 1866 by the composer, and Karl Tausig, who was a pupil of Liszt, died very young. Again, Clara Schumann was delighted, and she herself worked on the sonata with Hermann Levi and wrote, "The work is splendid, but it cannot be called a sonata. Rather a work whose ideas you must scatter over an entire orchestra as if from a horn of plenty. Right from the first time I played it, I had the feeling of its being an arrangement." On Levi's advice, and probably taking in some of Clara Schumann's comments as well, Brahms then remodelled the work for the piano quintet. When that was done, Levi commented, "Anyone who did not know it in its earlier forms of string quartet and piano sonata would never believe it was not originally thought out and designed for the present combination of instruments. It does not contain a single note, leading me to suspect that it is an arrangement. You've turned a monotonous work for two pianos into a thing of great beauty, the like of which we have not seen since the year 1828. A little bit of a different tone there. Turned this monotonous work for two pianos, whereas previously he seemed very happy with it. Anyway, he himself, so looking back to Schubert and recognizing the connection from Schubert through to Brahms. Perhaps the key question is this: why did Brahms make the transition to the piano sonata and then the piano quintet? Certainly he took on some of the criticism from Joachim of the original version and came to see the string quintet as inadequate. He might therefore at some point have simply burnt the score, as he did with so many others, and we would have been none the wiser. We would not have been able to talk about the piece. But he didn't. He presumably considered the music to be of good quality, but that he just hadn't found its optimal form. Perhaps he considered that the overpowering strength, as Joachim had put it, in the music needed the weight of sound that only a piano could give. But was the two-piano version then intended as the final form? Or, as with many piano arrangements, which I've mentioned already, was it always considered to be just that, an arrangement? My feeling is that having recognised that the string quintet couldn't give the powerful percussive edge that he wanted some of the music to have, he made an experimental arrangement to see where he ended up, giving it to two pianos. Brahms actually liked the two-piano version very much. As we know, he was, after all, a very fine pianist. But I think it was the intervention of Clara Schumann and Hermann Levi that convinced him to move that extra step to the piano quintet. They realised that this was music that didn't fit within the homogeneous group to which Brahms had thus far given the music. It needs something almost akin to the heterogeneous nature of the orchestra, and the piano quintet grouping gave Brahms that possibility. When thinking about that change from the piano sonata to the piano quintet, it's important to note that neither of the two piano parts for the two piano players in the sonata matches the piano part that we have for the quintet. The scoring of each version is largely independent, and the piano and strings have very equal roles. Some would say that certain passages work better in the two piano medium and some in the quintet version. So I keep saying quartet, I beg your pardon, in the piano quintet version. And we'll take a listen to some of those things a little bit later. In terms of the music itself, there are connections backwards to Brahms' own F minor piano sonata and forwards to his First Symphony. However, the overall mood, as I mentioned earlier, is quite dark. Perhaps there's a feeling of heroic tragedy in there, and unlike that aforementioned sonata and symphony, there's no triumphant major key ending. Let's look at the piece in a little bit more detail. 4 movements: allegro non troppo in F minor, andante un poco adagio A flat, scherzo allegro C minor to C major, and finale is poco sostenuto, allegro non troppo, and presto non troppo, F minor. Now, it's interesting, when I first thought about doing this, agreed this with Stephanie, doing this talk about this piece, my first thought was, gosh, Brahms Quintet, wonderful piece. What am I going to say about it? As I've gone on, I've realised there's far too much to say. So that little introduction is of course, a real synopsis of the overall situation. And also time does not permit to go into the music in great detail. Nonetheless, I will get on and do what I can in the time we have available. So the first movement, the allegro non troppo, which is very much F minor. Now let's think about the opening, the very, very opening of the piece. Let me actually play you immediately the very opening. Sorry, no, actually, I'm not going to play it to you. I'm just going to show it to you first. I beg your pardon. Then I'm going to take you from those first bars just a few bars further on. To the note that ends that first system. So you can see that C7 chord. And then the next system here. That bit there is essentially the first theme of this piece. Having had a little look at that, I'll just return to the first bars so you can see how very similar they are. Not quite as long as the theme complete was. It's almost as if Brahms is giving us a pre-echo. One important question is, because the theme itself is marked as very loud, Brahms here writes MF, so considerably softer, but with a certain amount of volume. How loud should it be? And I think this is a question that many performers are uncertain about. Sometimes, and in fact not infrequently in the recordings I've listened to at any rate, the beginning sounds almost apologetic. Let's listen to it in a couple of different versions and see how it strikes you. So this is going to be the very beginning. I think it's actually a very difficult thing to get right. There was what I thought was a lovely feeling of exploration, particularly in the two piano version. Just not quite sure where we're going yet, and then we get to the real point. It does feel like a first idea, which it sounds like it is the way that Brahms has written it. But it did sound really rather soft, and marrying those two things up, I think, is actually surprisingly tricky. The way it was played, actually, in both of those recordings, begs an important question, which one can ask across all of this music. Should it be the same speed? The problem is within the question, of course, the word should. That suggests that there's one right way. Thankfully, there isn't. There are a multitude of possible right, good ways. Personally, I think some tempo flexibility is good, but probably best kept fairly minimal. Indeed, on first playing the piece, say at a first rehearsal, it's probably best to do very little at all, except, of course, where tempo changes are marked by Brahms. I'm talking about sort of rubato tempo fluctuations within sections where nothing is actually marked by the composer. And then in your rehearsal, at a subsequent point, you may feel that you know the music sufficiently well to start, if you feel it requires it, to pull around the tempo a little bit. There's a good little moment there towards the end of that clip that I just played you, where we get into the second theme of the, well, essentially first subject group. Let me play you that in a different recording, and I'll show you the score as well, and you will hear an even bigger speed change going on. So you heard there a really quite significant writ into that second theme. And then after they played it at a slower tempo for a little while, they just slowly ramped the speed back up. It's rather lovely to hear that second theme at that speed. But personally, whilst I think a little writ like that into it, in what is bar 22 for anybody perhaps looking at their own score, I personally prefer it to be nearly at the same speed as the opening. Brahms puts in, I think, sufficient differences for it to work perfectly fine at the same speed. However, the second time that passage occurs, very similar point in the music, well, in fact, exactly the same point within the music, there is an unusual modulation, and personally, I would there want a little bit more time, as indeed we do here in this rendering. Come on. That seemed to go very, very quickly. I'm actually going to play that again so you can hear that again. As we approach at the beginning of this system here, it's basically the same harmonies as we heard the first time, but then the cello coming in on the tune with that G flat rather than the original D flat, which sort of continues the first melody, if you like. It's quite a surprise. So I think the slowing down there is not unreasonable at all. Couple of little details, couple of little thoughts. Dots. A dot over or under a note seems such a simple little thing, and yet its interpretation, as I suspect you know, is not at all so simple. According to Clive Brown, whose book I'll mention again later, talking about this period of music, sometimes the staccato mark seems to have been used merely to shorten a note, sometimes to indicate both shortening and emphasis, and sometimes apparently to indicate primary accent. For my current purposes, I will simply say that it seems to depend on the context. So here is an example from this piece, which I will just bring up. So right back to the opening part of the quintet. So you remember I said there's the note at the end of that first system with a lovely little dot in it on all the parts, taking us into the main theme. Let's just consider those dots. Which type of dot do we have here? We have an 8-note piano spread at the bottom of that chord. All the strings are just playing one C, but an 8-note spread chord in the piano. Quite a bit of an emphasis is given by a pianist doing that sort of thing in and of itself. I think it needs strength and emphasis, and we are, of course, going from where we were at forte into a fortissimo tune. String players, I think, are prone to equate such type of dots with a bounce of the bow, a bow coming off the string. Here, I would suggest to get the right effect, it actually needs to be an on the string stroke. And in fact, literally, technically, with lots of forearm, as indeed is required by the dots in the preceding bars that you see there. So there are the first two bars on that line, I think all, possibly with the exception of one or two, but basically all the notes have those types of dots there. They certainly do not want to be light and bouncy notes coming off the string, I don't think. I think they want that strong on the string feel. Another small matter, but small matters all add up, don't they? The exposition of this piece has a repeat, very standard within music that's either in sonata form or a type of sonata form. Personally, I feel rather cheated if we don't get the repeat, because actually the first ending, the first time bars that Brahms writes, are not the same as the second ending, so we would miss out on 5 bars that he wrote. More importantly than that, though, is the basic function of an exposition repeat, which is that it lays the ground for harmonic flights of fantasy in the development by being just that, the ground, the affirmation of if you like, the F minor tonality in this case. But then, pragmatically, if you're doing this in a concert, there's other music to play, it's hard work. This music, it takes a lot out of you. You might feel that it's worth just not doing that repeat to conserve a little energy. Last thing to mention about this movement is that it's not really a loud movement. We tend to think of first and last movements of major works as being significant and really quite chunky and probably loud. That opening feeling gives us that idea that it is or is going to be a loud, powerful movement. Well, it certainly has that, if you like, muscular characteristic within that first theme, but a lot of the music is more restrained. The second subject, as second subjects very often are, is a real contrast. By the way, within that sentence, there is a lot one could unpack, which I won't do now, but it would be interesting to think about that sometime as to why first and second subjects are so often like that. So yes, the second subject is a real contrast. We had that a little bit earlier. The second subject you would have expected, by the way, wouldn't you, to have been in C, not C sharp. D flat, C sharp. Immediately, Brahms is there setting up the importance of the D flat within the F minor tonality. And as we saw, the end of the scherzo, another moment where he shows how important that D flat, that submediate note, is in this piece. Yeah, by the way, just going back for any of you that know the Brahms's piano sonatas, that F minor piano sonata, which is opus 5, has some similarities in that very respect as well, the importance of that submediate note. Anyhow, let's just hear again that second subject, which contains another group of tunes which range in mood from the charming to the pathetic in the pathos sense of that word. Also note how the piano gives an almost constant triple time rhythm, which then gives way to the first subject's arpeggiated semiquavers, 16th notes, which however subside for the final section into the repeat. And there we had the lack of the repeat. They went into the second section. So I've finished my little look at the first movement, and we're going to have a break in a moment. I'm just going to fill you in with a little sort of interlude, really, just telling you what resources I've used for what I've done, or at least the main ones. Here I'm going to put into chat a little list, and then I'll just quickly explain what it is. Here we are. Okay, so into chat going. Okay, so I've listed there some of the recordings I've used. This is not at all me suggesting that these are the best recordings. I have shied away from any such tendency. These are just what I have used. So there you have the two piano sonata. By the way, I don't think I said it's known as Opus 34B, although of course written at a different time. Marta Argerich and Alexandra Rabinovich. Then there's a version which Robin Holloway orchestrated, which is actually really quite interesting at times, on Toccata Classics. And then there is, I've not mentioned this yet, there is a reconstruction of the string quintet. Somebody's sort of reconstructed backwards from the piano quintet and the two piano version what might have been in the string quintet. NC Kartunen, also on Toccata Classics. Then the quintet itself, I've used two recordings. You've probably noticed that there have been two versions. One is the Kodai quartet with Yeno Yando on Naxos, and the second one is a group called Ironwood, who I think are in Australia, on ABC Classics. I was intrigued that they're playing on period instruments. I think it's the only version there is of the quintet on period instruments. I may be wrong, but it's the only one I've noticed. And then there's what I think is quite an interesting, I've only skimmed it actually, but an interesting looking article about Brahms' lost works and about his destruction of his works, which you might, again, another rainy day idea. And finally, I mentioned earlier a Clive Brown, who, if this is not everybody's cup of tea at all, but it is a fairly sizable book. But it's classical and romantic performing practice, 1750 to 1900. So it's the whole of the era from the end of the Baroque, if you like, up until we sort of start beginning the so-called modern musical era. And he goes into quite a lot of detail about things like, slurs, dots, all sorts of stuff, not just those details, but really interesting read. I've not read it all. I've only dipped into it for particular things which interest me. However, there we are. That's the main stuff I've used. I think it's time to have a little 5-minute break. Good. Hello. So back to the quintet. Second movement, Andante un poco adagio in A flat. Firstly, I've just written charming ? The second movement is more modest than the first. It caused Clara Schumann to enthuse how rapturously it sings and rings from beginning to end. To me, it seems most charming, particularly that initial, well, it's not quite a Scotch snap, but it has that same rhythm, body, causing me to feel rather puzzled at Joseph Joachim's comment that what was lacking in the piece was indeed precisely that, charm. Did Joachim sort of overlook this movement in his assessment of the whole? I'm tempted to suggest that possibly when he and his colleagues played through it, they didn't play it in a very charming manner. When I gave you the list I put into chat of the recordings and such forth that I've used, I mentioned that string quintet. Doing it again. String quintet reconstruction. Let me just play you that reconstruction of the opening of this second movement. Interesting. Do you? Well, of course, I was showing you the piano quintet score there because I don't have a copy of the string quintet. It never occurred to me until this very minute to actually look and see whether it's available. Perhaps it is. There's another rainy day idea for you. Go searching for the string quartet version of this piece. But you probably heard there how the tune was given to the higher cello and the violas, and then there's the second cello is playing the bass part below that. Rather nice, fits rather lovely. I mean, the altogether homogeneous sound of the string quintet, I think, really works at a moment like that. I would use the word charming for something of that type. That charming nature, however, is rather undermined by Brahms by some speed changes. Let me play you the next little bit, pretty much, of this, but this time in the piano quintet version. So we've entered into a different phase of that piece, which, in another hand, could have been quite different. Could have remained calm, tranquil, all the way through. Personally, I would aim to make those. There's a cellorando and a stringendo, isn't there, that we just passed by? I would aim to make those, really quite telling, really noticeable for the audience, particularly, because it does give a particular flavour to a movement that is started in such a calm manner. Very different speed there taken by that second group, wasn't there, to the string group. both sound very nice to me. Second thing to mention about this movement is that the first section, if you like, the calmer section, is completely in simple time. And then the new E major section contains a mix of simple and compound triplet movement time. We met this in the Schubert octet. Perhaps you might look at this and think, should we marry some of this up? Let me show you what I'm talking about. So here, let me just check I'm on the right system. So yes, this system here. If you look at the end of that line, of that system, you see the left hand of the piano, the octave Bs and then the octave Cs, the dotted rhythm. One could say, well, should those short notes, the semiquavers, the sixteenths, should they line up with the triplets above? In this case, principally in the viola. In the Schubert octets, there was just one overall musical effect, and I think that is the consideration. Here there are two contrasting effects. I don't think there's any need whatsoever to fit the rhythms together. Sometimes, as a sort of shorthand, this matter is thought of as a function of composition date. If it's earlier music, then you would probably put the rhythms together, make them coincide exactly. If it's later music, then let them remain separate. Yeah, that sort of works as a shorthand, but in reality, it's not to do with date. I think it's to do with musical affect, of the number of musical gestures that coexist. Certainly, it is true that later music tends to consist of more than one musical gesture at a time than does earlier music. So in that sense, as a shorthand, it sort of works. Third thing to mention is a bit which to me sounds, I don't know, I've written proto-Mahler here. Let me show you what I'm talking about. It's, again, for anybody on a score, 55 to 64 bars in this movement. There are leaps of an octave and then of a ninth, and there are a number of leaps of a ninth. Again, actually undermining that initial, very simple calm. As an aside, I'd certainly say that some portamento here is a good thing in the strings. Sadly, one can't really do it on the piano, but to highlight the unusual and poignant nature of the intervals. When I played this through 6 weeks or so on the viola, I was just gobsmacked by playing those ninths. It just felt so strange. Let me show it to you and then listen. We can listen to it. think musically that's one of the most extraordinary passages in this whole fabulous piece. Third movement. We started off, I chose a little bit of the third movement to set us off going, the scherzo, which he titles with an allegro marking in C minor, and then we have the trio section in C major, and then of course we have repeat of the scherzo minor section. Whatever charm the second movement may or may not have had, we're now back to a very serious and passionate bit of writing. Within just, I think, probably the first 30 seconds of the music, we have been introduced to three apparently disparate musical ideas, which Brahms then weaves together with enormous skill throughout the movement. Let's listen to a bit of this. I particularly loved the fugal section, which was actually just starting as I faded it out. And of course, fugal is always a sign of serious composition. Let me play on. You can hear this fugal section just from where we stopped there. It's entitled Letter B in this score. It's interesting, just off my notes for a moment, but very much true that I think for a lot of composers, certainly since the time of Mozart, who was a great fugue writer, Beethoven as well, of course, became very interested in fugue throughout his life and started writing fabulous fugues. Brahms, many others have studied fugal writing, fugal composition. And it became a mark of somebody who knew what they were doing, essentially. So for somebody like Brahms, who, as I say, wanted his music to be just everything to be as perfect as possible, unassailable, as he wrote, writing fugues at some point in his music was de rigueur. There wasn't an option. It just had to be there. And it's absolutely fine. In some composers' hands, fugues, but in a great composer like Brahms's hands, fugues, like just about everything else, work absolutely wonderfully. The trio section, so that's a little bit of the scherzo. The trio section is perhaps more noble than the serious and very passionate nature of the scherzo. It's fairly short, however, and then, of course, as I said, it gives way to a verbatim repeat of the powerful scherzo. In a movement like this, where we have scherzo, trio, scherzo, the structure of the music is there for the audience to hear. If they've never heard the music before, they very quickly grasp the structure of something of that type. Although as a player, certainly one will do the same. I think sometimes in some situations, when you're involved, you're down and dirty with the notes, you're involved in playing all of this stuff, the bigger scale stuff can pass us by. And I think it is really worth trying at some point, perhaps when one starts is a good point, or even before one starts playing it, just getting a bit of an overview of the structure of the music, I think can be really helpful. Because I'm thinking there of the listener. The listener in particular, I think even if they have heard it before, even if they know it, they really do relate to the structure. We as listeners relate to the structure of music. And so I think as a performer, getting a good idea of what that structure is can be really helpful. It's an element that one can then make clearer to the audience, and it guides them through the music in a helpful manner. Okay, so next thing about the third movement, the scherzo. I just want to look again at a little bit of comparison between the piano quintet version and the two piano sonata version. And that assertion I put out earlier, that just possibly some sections in the two piano version sound better than in the quintet version. So let me just play you one possible such candidate. And then the version for the pianos. Apologies, I rather got my synchronization wrong there. I'm going to do that again and try and synchronize better where the music was with where I was showing you in the music, and it goes past very fast. I'm sorry, I muddled that up slightly. So let's just try that one once more. So that again, the section we did here earlier, didn't we, when I was talking about the importance of the D flat down to the C and comparing it with the end of the Schubert quintet. What a wonderful piece that is, by the way. I'm sure you know that already. Anyway, the point of just playing you those two things there was to compare and contrast how that section sounds when it's played by the piano quintet and how it sounds when it's played by the two pianos. Personally, I think the two pianos version is really wonderful. The sort of percussive edge that two pianos have, hammering between them, if you like. Sorry, pianists, that's not meant in a derogatory sense whatsoever, but the wonderful power that two pianos have. I don't quite get the same feel. It's still wonderful in the quintet, but there is something, I think, a little extra in that percussive power that the pianos give in that two piano version. Do you know, actually, I've just noted down that reminds me of what happened, a completely different piece of music, but what happened when Brahms first performed his first movement of his fourth symphony in a four-hand piano arrangement for some friends. There was apparently a somewhat uncomfortable silence on the movement's conclusion. And then the influential critic Eduard Hanslick, who was a great supporter of Brahms, declared, "I feel like I've just been beaten up by two intelligent people." I think that's the most delightful comment. It does tell you possibly something about Brahms' piano playing. It sounds like it was very, very direct and forthright. Okay, so we're talking about the quintet more than the sonata here, but in order to get that powerful percussive nature into the sound of the quintet, which I think is what's required, again, there's a need to think about the bow stroke for the strings. And here I do think that the bouncing of the bow is crucial. Now, unless you're Jascha Heifetz, bow bouncing, certainly for me, it works at certain speeds and doesn't really work at other speeds. And it's the sort of thing you may just need to test out amongst yourselves. The amount of experience that you have as individuals and as a group, what is going to work and what isn't going to work. However, it certainly, I think, needs a little bit of throwing caution to the wind. It's got if you like, a slightly demonic edge to it, this section. Don't try and play it carefully. And just to finish off this point about this section, note what have I written here? Yes, okay. So let me just show you again the score that we've just been listening to. Just going to show it to you rather than listen to it this time. So a little bit of the quintet version. Where are I? Am I on the right page? No, I'm on the wrong page. I'm looking at, this page here. So if you look, for example, at the first violin and viola parts, at the end of this line, not just at the end of this line, a few times throughout this line, look particularly at when they have two separate 16th notes, two separate semiquavers with rests either side of them. And then if we look again at the piano version of that, so it's in the second bar here, in the second piano part, so the third stave down, you'll see the same sort of thing. So you've got those two 16th notes with rests either side of them. Just think about the pianist playing that. So the pianist has got their left hand playing the bum, ba bum, ba bum rhythm. And then in the right hand, at those moments, they're bouncing off, if you like, the left hand, which is bum, ba bum, ba bum. Excuse me, I know you don't use your thumb like that. But that's what you're doing. You're bouncing off the left hand into the right hand. However, for the violin and viola there, they're bouncing off somebody else. That's what I'm trying to say. So in the first bar there, the first violin is bouncing off the second violin, and the viola is doing the same. The first violin and viola are playing at the same time, of course. And that's what's happening each time, the first violin and viola. They're bouncing off somebody else, and that's tricky. For the pianist, it's slightly easier because you're just going but-on, sort of left to right hand. It's all you. When it's somebody else, it's not at all so easy. So I'm not going to give you an answer to that. You can try, certainly, if it becomes an issue, and if the music slows down, it may be because of this. If it does become an issue, you can try adding a note into the first violin and viola part. So they play 3 notes. They play 1 extra note before the 2 that are written. So 3 16th notes in a row. Ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-bum, rather than ba-bum, ba-bum. And that might be a way in which, at a slower speed at any rate, you can just appreciate what's going on. Last little comment, I said I wasn't going to provide any solutions. Here I am suggesting possible solutions. Another really important part of this, although I was talking about the bow needing to bounce, the bow also needs to be very close to the string. If your bow is off the string, is that far above the string before you play those 2 16th notes, you're never going to reach it in time. It's got to be really, really, really close. Okay, yes, that's the end of that bit. Let's, however, before I leave the third movement, let's just listen to a little bit of the trio. So this is the major section, which comes in the middle of the scherzo. So, and in fact, I think this sounds absolutely wonderful in the orchestral version by Robin Holloway. So I'm just going to play you a little bit of that. And of course, we don't have the score for that, but I can, of course, show you the quintet score, and you can, just take a little look at what Mr. Holloway has done in doing his arrangement. Would Brahms have done it like that? Who knows? In fact, Holloway, in his very good CD sleeve notes for that recording, says he hasn't tried to do it as he thinks Brahms might have done it. He's done it as he feels it works well in his terms, and he knows. He says, "I know I've done some things which Brahms wouldn't have done. There's some use of the timpani, which certainly Brahms I don't think would have done. Some of the colours, some of the use of the brass, not quite what Brahms would have done. Nevertheless, I think the basic point stands that actually the lushness of the horn sound at the beginning of that trio and the lushness of the complete string sound, I think fits very, very nicely what Brahms has given us there. So finally, the finale, poco sostenuto, then allegro non troppo, and finally presto non troppo. And we're back now to F minor. Excuse me. You remember the Schubert octet, how the opening of the final movement is different from pretty much everything else. This is kind of similar. There's no obvious thematic connection here to the music that went before or that follows, although there is a continuing heavy use of semitones. But I think, like in that Schubert octet, this is a curtain raiser, a scene setter. I'm going to play you this in several versions, just see how you feel it works in the different mediums that this music has been through. So here I will show you the music, the actual score of the quintet, even though I'm not, of course, always showing you, not always playing you the quintet. Here we are. fear not, that's all the versions I can play you. I did at one point think about getting that sort of piano concerto version. I thought, no, this is just too much. But maybe go ahead and look that out at some point and see what you make of that. But I found it quite interesting to just do just one comparison of all of those versions. Of course, notwithstanding keeping in mind that the first one you heard, the string quintet one, is a reconstruction, not Brahms himself. But the question I want to ask firstly is, what does it mean to say poco sostenuto? Simply in terms of tempo, what is that about? Actually, poco sostenuto is not really that helpful, is it? In the first movement, I don't know if you noticed, I can't remember if I actually showed you this bit, there's another poco sostenuto written. It's the shortish F major section near the end of the first movement, where actually a little bit of calm comes before a final minor section takes over. That's perfectly understandable because of what has gone before. The one here at the beginning of this finale is, to me, rather like the one at the beginning of the first symphony, where we have un poco sostenuto. There's no context. It feels like something is missing. We need something like allegro, un poco sostenuto. Allegretto, un poco sostenuto. Brahms, however, does give us a nice little clue in a moment, though, because if I show you this just a little bit later in the quintet score, so that is where we left it off, just a little bit later, page or so later, where we have allegro non troppo. He actually wrote, in my language, minim equals crotchet, possibly in yours half note equals quarter note. That does not appear actually in the piano version. Interestingly, one could theorize that he felt it was necessary to do so in writing the quintet version after the piano version. Maybe he just thought, oh, they're just not getting the speed relationship right between these two sections. I need to tell them. That being the case, the only version that really adhered to that of the ones that I just played you was the first one, that string quintet reconstruction, where I don't know if you had the same feeling on hearing it. You thought, gosh, that's fast. I'd never heard it that fast before, but I'd never thought through it like this before. And they do. They play basically the same meter. The one beat equals the other across the divide into the allegro non troppo. So that's an interesting little thing to think about. And I think it works very well in the way in which they've done it. Maybe, if you have the opportunity to play this music, that's something to try out. Perhaps if you did react like me, thinking, well, that's just too fast, maybe just give it a go. Just keep the tactus the same either side of the allegro and see how it feels. Certainly the allegro we've just got to, where that marking is in the quintet score, certainly that needs to be a non troppo allegro. We've got più animato sections, faster sections coming, and also a presto right at the end of the movement, of course. So Brahms wants to give us, I think, that good contrast with the non troppo. And I think it's quite a sort of lilting section, also, even, dare I say it, rather charming. Second thing to mention, penultimate thing to mention about this movement is the false ending. Let me show you this in the score. Oops, here. Okay, so what I'm talking about is what you see on that line there. So we've had a really loud section, very powerful, and we reach what could very easily have been the end of the music. We've had these powerful F minor chords there at what is in this score letter H. And the bar after letter H, or possibly the bar after that, could very easily have been the end of the music. But the way in which 2 bars after letter H, he pulls that F minor chord away into a, what is it? It's a G7, isn't it? He pulls us, and suddenly we're back into the maelstrom. We've not been allowed to rest. I think he's really, really remarkable and needs pointing out. And the only way I can think of pointing it out, because I want the audience to hear this, I want the audience to sort of, it's not like a Haydn joke quite, is it? But perhaps it's a Brahms joke, a different type of joke. I want them to hear that actually we sort of thought as players this could be it, but no, we're pulled off somewhere else. Let's have a listen to that. Yeah, the very section starting actually from the preceding page, I think. So we're going from about the top of this page here, a page earlier than I just showed you. They did it a little bit. They just sort of held us back before sending us off. I think I would prefer personally to do it a little bit more than that. Maybe a little uncouth to do so, but Brahms was not the most couth of people, actually, surprisingly. The real ending, however, let's just look at the real ending. The presto coda. Let me show you that actually, rather than just talking it. The presto coda, which is here. And then if you just look at what has happened just before this presto coda, the music has wound right down. I'll show you one more system above that. So we've got a sempre dim e rit written at the end of that line. And then we go into pianissimo, dim again. So we need to get very soft, and I think really, really quite slow as well. And then the presto, which I was going to say bursts in, but it bursts in softly because it begins softly. Again, there's a similarity here to that third F minor piano sonata, which, yeah, it does remind us of, I think, a little. Actually, it also reminds me of Pirates of the Caribbean, but perhaps I should keep quiet about that. This is also, by the way, a dot under notes thing, which you'll see there, the first just 3 notes, I think, in the cello, second violin and first violin parts. He's written non-legato as well, and I think the implication is he wants you just to keep on playing with those short dotted notes. I attempted to talk about whether the string parts, again, are off the string, but instead, although related, consider thinking about the speed in terms of the presto from the very end. At what speed do the last 3 bars make sense to you? These bars here. where the piano and the second violin give us a very clear F minor perfect cadence, and the first violin, viola and cello give us that descending scale outlining F minor. I think, to me, that determines how the rest of the movement should be. You do occasionally get people who sort of play around with the time there. I think one of the recordings I'm going to play you, perhaps yes, I think it's the two pianos version, they do slightly play around with the time. But essentially what makes those bars work will make the whole of the presto work. Excuse me. There is, by the way, and we'll listen to it and so you'll see it, the word agitato comes up a couple of times, agitated. So this is, like I said, this is powerful, passionate music. There's no rounding off of the dark F minor mood, as I mentioned, unlike in the First Symphony and unlike in that third piano sonata. Here, Brahms drives us to the end in an agitated manner. What was Brahms like? I mentioned a minute ago that he could be rather uncouth. Well, in terms of darkness, he certainly doesn't seem to have suffered from the type of depression which, say, an Elgar or, more pertinently, perhaps a Schumann did suffer from. But he wasn't an easy man, apparently getting on with most adults pretty badly. Better with children, unhappy in relations in general, unlucky in love. Perhaps we have here some insight of some of the pains that Brahms experienced and which, unlike someone like Beethoven, he tried his utmost to control. Let me play you the end of this quintet. I've written down the wrong page number there, haven't I? There we go. Beg your pardon. Sorry, I meant to play you the quintet version first. As you heard, there was a rather affected little pause before the two penultimate quavers, eighth notes at the end of the penultimate bar. A little conclusion, which will be about 1 more minute. Which version of this piece works best? Does it matter? That's a perfectly reasonable response to that question. I do think, in fact, I was just listening to the piano sonata version there, that it's a really good thing for the quintet to do, to listen to that version. I think you learn things about what you're going to do as a quintet by hearing that other version. I mean, the orchestral arrangement that I've played you bits of course, is not by Brahms nor the string quintet reconstruction, but in the orchestral version, it's great having that warm sound. Maybe some of that was in Brahms' mind, as Clara Schumann seems to suggest. Lovely to hear some brass colours as well at times, but I miss the piano. Holloway has actually, and he doesn't mention this in his sleeve notes, he's actually added some bits. I don't mean he's sort of added some bits here. He's actually added some bits here. He's actually added 1 or 2 bars into the music, which really surprised me. I thought I'd lost my place in the score, and then I realised, no, 3 or 4 times at least he's added little bits in. Very peculiar. Anyway, it's worth hearing, I think. Listening to the reconstruction, that reconstruction of the string quartet. Again, at times I'm rather disappointed missing the incision of the piano. But there are some wonderful times when there's a real calmness, particularly of the string sound, of the all-together string sound. I want to keep both the sonata and the piano quintet. The sonata is quite wonderful at times, and particularly, as I mentioned, the loud and percussive sections. But the combination in the quintet of piano for weight, strings for cantabile and sostenuto, and I know it's not totally as simple as that, but anyway, for me, that combination I think is the best of all. The crown of his chamber music, the greatest, who could say, I don't know, perhaps Brahms thought so. He thought very highly of this music, but ultimately it's what you think and what you let your audience think. I think I shall leave that there. Maybe we have a minute or two if there are any comments or questions.
Sure, I would love to open it up to the floor. I've seen some action in the chat. But actually, I have a question for everyone here. If you know how to raise your Zoom hand. How many of you have actually played this piece in either of these versions or both of these versions? Susan has. Susan, either or both?
Actually, I've played some of the piano version, but all of the quintet version.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Charles Brooks, Charles, you've been making comments in the chat about the string quintet version. So have you played that quintet reconstruction? Oh, so could you please unmute? Actually, I just noticed. Yeah.
Yes, last summer I played the 2-cello version. The Sebastian Brown is the one I referred to in the chat, which I'm told is the most successful. I think there are 3 versions. Peter might know, but that works quite well. I dare to disagree with Joachim that string quintet version actually works quite well. Maybe I've got the piano version in my head because I also play the piano in the piano version. And by the way, referring to one of Peter's comments about the polka sostenuto in the last movement, the string version, of course they can play it faster. They don't have to cope with the letters C and G in the piano part. They can get through that rather more slickly than pianists, except right at the top of their profession. It's a real corner. Yeah, and there's a recording of the Sebastian Brown. It's
I
certainly
didn't find that. I didn't see.
available in the UK here.
Right.
Paul Barrett
know.
leading his divertimento ensemble.
Hmm.
And you can I'm sure you can get it via Amazon or whatever. I commend it to you.
So
Thank you.
Charles, how do you get the sheet music for the Sebastian Brown? Is it who published the?
Yeah, it is available. It was a fellow cellist who got hold of it through a well-known academic bookshop in the UK called Blackwell's, and he managed to track that down with no perceptible difficulty, as far as I know.
Nice.
And it's quite modestly priced too.
Good. Well, if you want to, Charles, if you want to send me an email or something with a link to that when we make a blog article about this, might be nice to a link to where people can buy it.
Okay.
The Sebastian Brown, the music in particular, I feel, because people might want to play that,
Yeah.
at a play-in or chamber music party.
Yeah.
Well, as I also said in my note, it's great to have another good two cello work to go along with with
There's
Schubert.
so few.
Yeah. In fact, you're giving me an idea for an excellent chamber music party. If you have a friend with two pianos, play all three.
Yeah. And also taking another point of Peter's, the piano version, a bit like the Schoenberg version of the piano quartet. It really highlights things that you might otherwise just sort of gloss over as not terribly important. But Schoenberg, for instance, brings out all sorts of wonderful things in the texture of the piano quartet that enables you to make the piano quartet performance just that bit better and bit different.
Yeah, thank you. Good point.
Peter, have you come across the piano version of the Brahms string quartet as well?
I know it exists, but no, I haven't heard it.
Yeah, they have a similar effect to the, only in my humble opinion, to the two piano version that you've been talking about of the piano quintet. They really bring some inner parts quite alive.
Nice.
Interesting. I didn't know those existed. So
Yeah.
his own version of the string quartets for two pianos?
Yeah, for piano duet.
For piano duet, four
Yeah.
hands.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. I played them at a course in Canada, actually, in a little place just on Lake Huron. It was a week's course. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Somebody threw them onto the piano stand, and we got going.
Wow.
Nice.
Interesting.
It is very interesting. It's a huge subject when you start getting into it. The arrangements that people made for all sorts of situations. Very interesting.
Yeah, especially when it's the composer himself making it, because as you said, it sheds light on how he was thinking about it, how he chose to arrange it. Peter, one thing I found kind of interesting when you played the excerpt of the string quintet recording of the second movement, the slow movement, it kind of explained to me a question I've always had as to why the second violin barely plays at all. And then when I was looking at, I was listening to it in the playback, I realized now it makes sense because there isn't anything really left for the second violin to play if you want to make a nice piano part.
It's true. It's true. It's sort of quartet music, that isn't it? That's certainly the beginning of that movement.
Yeah, but in the quintet version, it's covering some of the stuff that would be like, you'd either have a one-handed piano part,
Yeah.
or no second violin. I thought it was, that was really interesting to hear that. And it's, I'm curious actually, Charles, you've played the other, you said that the Sebastian Brown is an early, it's like 1947. Is that what you said it was?
46, it's listed that, yeah.
Did,
1946.
Based
at
on
least
what you, based
that's
on
what
that little excerpt you heard, are some of the choices similar? Like I thought that choice to have the viola and the upper cello, for example, playing the melody, like that was like very Brahmsian sound. Is that, was that the same in the Sebastian?
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yes, it's much the same. Yeah, and going back to your second violin business, Brahms does it elsewhere. He's very fond of dropping out one of the instruments. It's one of the piano quartets where the viola does nothing until letter B of the third movement. It's just piano, violin, and cello.
Haydn does that too.
He's certainly guilty of crime elsewhere.
Well, it's interesting. I'm a violist myself, and Haydn does that often in sort of trios, in his string quartets and a trio, the viola. And then okay, on a positive note, the impact when the viola comes in.
Yeah.
That's what makes it.
Yeah.
You take it away because it's what's going to make it when you put it back in. That's
Absolutely so.
my take on it.
Yeah.
But it's not uncommon, but it was just interesting to hear it just in the 5 strings that way. It just worked kind of perfectly, I thought.
Yeah, it does.
That movement in particular.
Yeah.
Anyone else here have any questions or thoughts, or would like to share any of your own personal experiences playing either the piano quintet or the string quintet or the piano, the 2 piano sonata? Is there anyone else, or have any questions about some of the things that Peter spoke about?
Mm.
Stunned into silence.
Yes. Well, Peter, you're so thorough. Maybe that it leaves.
Oh
leaves
gosh, I left out so much. That's the terribly difficult thing about doing things like this is that when you start looking into them, there's so much you can talk about. You have to make those choices about what to leave out. Lots of stuff. I always have at the end of these sort of talks, I have a little section I call, well, it isn't a little section, I call other stuff. And I just put other stuff into that and it goes boom, 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 boom.
Well, I'll say 2 things since no one else is talking. I thought that when you were talking about the scherzo and you showed the way that the 2 piano version treated it, it really showed me why there's a section in there that's impossible to play. It's impossible to play the piano part in the quintet version is impossible to play. It's that where the piano has like these octaves, and so and in the 2 piano version, those things were distributed differently, and it just looked like it would be a lot easier to play it that way. And it still looked really hard, but it just seemed like it was not quite as awkward, and so that explained a lot to me about why that's such an awkward place in the quintet, that he was taking something, that sounded a certain way when he wrote it in that previous sort of sketch version, I guess, and trying to figure out, well, now how do I do this? And it gave the piano, something that's just things that are hard to do at the same time, maybe, or but it is a very, very, very awkward place for the piano. So that was so interesting to me. And the other thing I wanted to say, because it was also about that movement, I was thinking about the C minor piano trio and kind of similarities between the scherzo movement and the scherzo in that trio. There's a C major theme in the trio part that they're very reminiscent of each other. And although in the trio it's a sunnier, it's even though it's mysterious in the minor key part and the major key part, it's very, very sunny in a way that this is not quite as sunny. This is kind of more triumphant, but those are kind of interesting to look at next to each other. Well.
Thank you. That's a really good point. Thank you.
Well, if we don't have any more comments or questions, I just want to tell you about an opportunity. Well, I have two things I want to announce. One of them is that we're having another ACMP. We have two more ACMP Listening Club events this season. The next one is not with Peter Fender. It's the violinist Gregory Fulkerson, who's kind of an Ives, a Charles Ives scholar and expert as well. He lives and breathes Charles Ives. I was reminded about him. My own string quartet coached with him about 10 years ago. And I asked him, I thought it was important that we celebrate Charles Ives' sesquicentennial this year. And he's going to do a talk that he's calling Demystifying Charles Ives. And he's going to talk about Charles Ives' background and his life and his interesting to ACMP members in particular, his dual career. You know, he was not only the youngest salaried professional organist in Connecticut history at the age of 14, but he also went on, after showing much musical promise, both as a pianist and composer, went on to a serious career in insurance. But what's very interesting, he's going to discuss Ives and also particularly the influence of Ives' father, who was a band leader, on his music. And he's going to use String Quartet number 1 as the primary example, the piece to explore, which is a very accessible piece. And if any of you have thought about playing Ives, the string players among you, it actually is possible by amateurs if you put some time and energy into it. So that's going to be Sunday, December 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern on Zoom, and it's already in the events directory, and I'll be sending emails about it. And more importantly, if you attended today, or if you were at Peter's Schubert Octet talk in July, I bet you some of you would love to meet Peter in person. I certainly would. And I bet you a lot of you, especially you string players, would love to get away and go to, say, Tuscany in April. I know I would as well. So Peter told me, and it's going to show up in the ACMP events directory sometime early next week. He's going to send us the information. He is leading a workshop. It's a string chamber music workshop, April 7th to 12th, 2025 in Tuscany. He will be one of the coaches, but there's also a young professional string quartet from London who will be the primary coaches, the Alciona String Quartet. And it sounds like a really wonderful, exciting opportunity. Peter, do you want to put something in the chat, a link in the chat in case anyone...
Yes, that's right. I was going to just put the link, wasn't I? So I'll
Yes,
just...
and we will be getting this, as I said, into the ACMP directory. But what a wonderful opportunity to be in a gorgeous place and not only meeting Peter, but have a chance to get his insights on whatever piece is unfortunate. I guess it would be a good place to do the string quintet version of the Brahms Quintet as being an all-string workshop. Yeah, but anyway, I just want to give a shout out about that.
Thank you.
And lastly, for any of you that might not already be members of ACMP, if you don't know much about us, we are a worldwide network of passionate adult amateur chamber musicians. We have a directory where you can find each other for playing. If you're traveling, if you're visiting somewhere, you can use it to find new friends where you're going. Susan actually is on our board and just returned from a trip to Japan, there's going to be a blog article about that soon. It was her second trip to Japan, in which she connected with ACMP members there. Some of those same Japanese members connected with people in Morocco last spring.
Wow.
It's a wonderful network. Membership is free. And we also have events directories where you can find out about things such as Peter's workshop once it's in there, and all sorts of other things like these events like today. So I highly encourage you to join, tell your friends. We want to grow our network because the more of us that are in it, the more fun everyone that's in it will have. So if you're not yet a member, take a look, acmp.net. I'm the executive director, and I think it is one of the most fun and happy kind of nonprofit organizations you will ever encounter. So I highly encourage you to become part of our ranks. And I want to say again, Peter, thank you so much. This was so informative and so interesting, and I really loved hearing all the recordings. And I look forward to, oh yes, and there's one more Peter event in the spring. It's March 2nd, I believe, right? Sunday, March 2nd. And it's going to be an exploration of women composers with a focus on Lily Boulanger. So I'll be sending more information about that soon and getting that in our directory. So I hope to see you all soon. And thanks again for coming. And we'll just look forward to the next one.